All right. Thank you very much. We're very honored to have the Honorable Mr. Ajit Pai, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, here as a guest at Tel Aviv University at the Center for the Study of the United States with partnership with the Fulbright program. I want to get right to it. Thank you very much again for taking part and coming to the campus. Right, so I want to talk to you a bit about the internet, about regulating the internet, about democracy. So when we think about access to the internet, do you foresee a time in the near future when access to broadband, access to the net in general, maybe like public education 100 years ago or civil rights, 50, 60 years ago, that it becomes a civil right to have access to the internet, something that every citizen is entitled to?
I certainly think in the United States, perhaps here in Israel and around the world as well, that the internet is increasingly important to so much that we do in our daily lives, starting a business, raising crops, educating kids, doing telemedicine and the like. And so we see it as our mission in the United States to make sure that internet access is as broadly distributed as possible so that everybody has access. And I don't think it's inconceivable within a generation or two that so many people are going to rely on it that we will come to see it as second nature in our daily lives. So that's part of the reason why our top mission at the FCC now and going forward is closing the digital divide, making sure that there are no Americans who are left behind in the 20th century, so to speak, when a 21st century digital economy is moving ahead. We want everyone to be able to be a participant in, as opposed to a spectator of that economy.
And what role do you see that does the federal government have in that, or is it something that the private industry is supposed to kind of lead the way?
I think the U.S. government and the FCC in particular have a fundamental role in making sure that these digital technologies are thriving and the people are innovating and investing. And I think first and foremost, we need to make sure that we have a regulatory framework that encourages companies, big and small, all across the country, to invest and to innovate. And secondly, we oversee at the FCC a subsidy program known as the Universal Service Fund. And that fund is meant to target parts of the country where the business case for deployment is often difficult. And under my leadership over the last 2 years, we've been redirecting that funding to make sure that every dollar that is spent closing the digital divide. And I'm proud to say that by reforming the fund in some important ways, we've been encouraging many more companies, especially non-traditional companies like electric utilities and satellite companies, to help close that divide.
I mean, so it's really interesting because on one hand, I think this government and also a lot of your decisions have promoted right, kind of especially what happened a year ago exactly, I think, right, kind of removing the Title II of the 1934 Communications Act and this idea of letting the market really kind of benefit consumers and removing government intervention on one hand. Do you see on the other hand, and I think you suggested this, that there is a role for government to subsidize even infrastructure to make sure that areas kind of left behind, as you say, like in rural America, certain parts of the inner cities where they have very little, if no broadband access at all. Does the government then have a role in subsidizing parts of those areas?
I do think the more important part is encouraging the private sector to take the lead, and the reason is that there is only so much money that the FCC has under its purview. And I think on the private sector side, for example, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars that are spent every single year trying to upgrade and to construct networks. And with respect to our fund, we have very limited resources at our disposal, and so that's part of the reason why we've seen it as our primary mission to make sure that our rules are modernized for the digital age, that we don't require companies, for example, to maintain the fading copper lines that are in the ground. We want to encourage them to invest in fiber. We also want to encourage new companies to invest and to innovate in the United States, whether it is 5G entrepreneurs or the next generation of satellite companies. We want to make sure that all of them have a full and fair opportunity to compete. And I think that if they're successful, if we are successful in our mission, then every American will come to have what I call digital opportunity.
I mean, looking back just at the past year, I don't know, maybe it's too early to tell, but do you think that, right, because that decision, obviously, it had a lot of criticism and it also had a lot of support. Do you think, or maybe it's too early to tell, that it has proven itself in terms of securing, open access and not allowing IPSs to jump up prices?
I think without question, our decision was the right one. I think if you look at the law, it was the correct reading of the law. But even beyond that, in terms of policy implications, our decision has been proven correct. Over the last year, the internet has remained free and open. Consumers have continued to be protected. And more recently, on the year anniversary, we saw a whole bunch of stories about how speeds over the last year have gone up 40% across the United States. We recently issued a report in which we found that the number of Americans who have access to fixed broadband providers, that is providers at home, two or more of them, has more than doubled to over 50% of the population. And so the trends are going in the right direction. And so going forward, I think we're going to continue to have the internet economy that is the envy of the world. We're going to continue to have a free and open marketplace for these ideas online. And we're going to continue to see more infrastructure investment. And that is a win all around, especially for consumers.
I mean, if we look beyond consumers, I guess, move kind of to thinking about the internet as a question of citizenship, not just as consumption. What role or criteria do you think the FCC should have, or even the federal government in general, for regulating the internet? I mean, when can and should it intervene? Do you think the FCC, for instance, has a role in combating fake news?
So I think traditionally speaking, there have been two limitations on the FCC's ability to act in this area. Number one is the First Amendment. The First Amendment to our Constitution prohibits the government from regulating speech, especially speech on new platforms like this. The second one is that traditionally the FCC's regulatory tools are appropriate when there's a market failure, when there's a marketplace that is irretrievably broken. And if it is not broken, then traditionally speaking, it's the competition authorities, both the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division, that would take a look at some of the competitive problems there. And so those are some of the limitations that guide our thinking in this area. And otherwise, we embrace the free market of ideas that I think has characterized American democracy for many, many years.
And so I think really the question of democracy, which is on everyone's minds when we think about the internet, especially what's happened in the last 2-3 years after the 2016 elections. So the question of fake news, right, and even cyber attacks and bots and so forth, not necessarily in geopolitical, also economic espionage and things like that. Is it possible that we're reaching a point where it becomes vital to regulate the internet in order to protect the rights, the civil liberties and American democracy and democratic institutions?
Certainly, I think if there's a question about the security of our networks, if our networks are under attack by a foreign adversary, then that is one thing. But I think when it comes to the government regulating the internet for the purpose of deciding which views should be allowed to be expressed, that is, I think, something that raises the antenna of certainly of regulators like me, and I think many Americans who embrace the First Amendment. And the famous dictum that is misallocated to Voltaire, which I might disagree with your what you're saying, but I will fight for the death for your right to say yes. And so I think that's the kind of thing that we want to be careful about the government getting involved in. But certainly when it comes to things like cybersecurity, there is a role, I think, for government to make sure that these networks are secure.
So in terms of of trying to combat or challenge or identify or obviate, I guess, the permeation of fake news, I mean, should it then be left, in a certain extent, to the private sector to do so?
I generally believe yes. I think that as one of our Supreme Court justices, Stephen Breyer, once said, that the solution to speech that people don't like is more speech. You have to enter the public square, make your argument forcefully, and over time we rely on the good judgment of Americans to discern what they believe, and ultimately I think that is the appropriate way to go forward in a democracy as vibrant and occasionally as discordant as ours.
Right. So just one final question to conclude. I want to think a bit more globally. When we think about the limits of sovereignty, especially when it comes to the internet, and here you're a guest in Israel, what are the limits of sovereignty when we try to regulate, to control, even to open up the internet, right? Because even the United States, as powerful as it is, cannot really do so, given just the transnational nature of the internet, right?
Well, certainly bits that travel over the internet don't respect federal or national boundaries, and that is certainly a challenge for national regulators like myself. On the other hand, I do think there is an important role for nation states in terms of some of the building blocks of the internet. For example, when it comes to 5G, the United States government works very cooperatively with our partners, especially Israel, on trying to figure out ways to push more spectrum into the commercial marketplace so that consumers can benefit from the next generation of wireless connectivity. And doing that requires some coordination among the various countries of the world. And I think that is going to continue to be an important function for national governments going forward.
All right, so very good. Thank you very much. And once again, Mr. Pai has been a guest of the Center for the Study of the United States at Tel Aviv University in partnership with the Fulbright program. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time.